Hello, it's Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's 8th Congressional District, and I wanted to come to address my friends to thank you for your commitment to fighting for human rights and democracy and freedom all over the world. And I want to especially salute all of those who are participating from Maryland's 8th Congressional District in Montgomery, Frederick, and Carroll County. As a member of the Executive Committee of the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I am very aware that the work that you do is helping to keep Congress focused on the plight of oppressed people everywhere and the violations of human rights that are taking place around the world. As you know, religious freedom and rights of conscience are critical values in America. The founders of our country rebelled against centuries of religious oppression and warfare, holy inquisition, crusades, witchcraft trials, and state domination of religions and religious domination of the state. And our nation was conceived in the idea of separating the church and state on the theory that the union of church and state degrades religion and corrupts government at the same time. I know that you are working hard to protect religious freedom and the rights of minorities and religious dissidents throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and serious human rights violations are being perpetrated there with alarming severity. I am of the mind that U.S. foreign policy must seek to promote human rights and democracy and the rule of law around the world, and that governments which violate the universal rights of their citizens must be held accountable. Congress has a fundamental constitutional role to ensure that human rights are fundamentally part of our foreign policy and reflective of the democratic ethos of our country. But I'm alarmed about what's going on in many of the Asian Pacific countries. In India, the government of President Modi is destroying the pluralistic and diverse society that has been the raison d'etre for India's democratic success for the last 70 years. So with my colleagues, I've been speaking out about the pernicious dangers of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the repression of freedom of speech in Kashmir and Jammu, and the attacks on religious freedom and human rights throughout the country. In China, that authoritarian government is carrying out horrific abuses against the Uyghur ethnic minority in a way that the U.S. Holocaust Museum has documented to constitute crimes against humanity. And recently, we've learned of even more shocking reports about forced sterilization of the Uyghur community. The mass imprisonment and re-education camps of thousands of Uyghurs now is transitioning into forced labor, essentially slave labor in the 21st century at factories whose products end up in the international stream of commerce and certainly in the United States. I have been working in Congress to introduce legislation and to exercise congressional oversight authority to address these horrific and serious offenses against human rights and human dignity throughout the world, and I will continue to do that. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020, passed by Congress and signed into law in June, authorizes the United States to impose broad sanctions against Chinese officials responsible for these policies of persecution and discrimination against Uyghurs. With bipartisan groups from the House and the Senate, I've also co-sponsored the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, recognizing that because the private sector seems either unable or unwilling to ensure that products and goods are not made with slave labor in China, the U.S. government must block such goods from coming in to our country. Meantime, in Burma, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people have been murdered, persecuted, forcibly deported from their homes, creating a moral crisis for our time and a great humanitarian and logistical crisis for the region. The Burmese military and government must be held accountable and must end these atrocities against the Rohingya people. The COVID-19 global pandemic has exacerbated the state of human rights violations around the world, and the U.S. must respond to defend desperately persecuted and oppressed people. The evidence is mounting that the world's dictators, the bullies, the autocrats, the strongmen are exploiting the global pandemic to further violate human rights, attack democracy, consolidate military and executive power, and criminalize the essential freedoms of speech, petition, assembly, and the free exercise of religion. To address this crisis, in June of this year, I introduced with several colleagues the bipartisan Protecting Human Rights During the Pandemic Act, which is legislation to install provisions and requirements for the State Department to push back on attacks against democracy and human rights that are made under the fraudulent guise of public health security, as too many governments use the COVID-19 crisis as a cover to impose their pre-existing plans to impose authoritarianism, censorship, and religious discrimination on their populations. In any event, I want to tell you that my door is always open to you. I thank you for meeting, and I thank you for your aggressive hard work during this very difficult time. Thank you again for everything that you are doing to advance human rights, democracy, and freedom all around the world. Hang tough and stay healthy and stay close.